you so much for joining us. On behalf of National Advocates for Pregnant Women, I'd like you to welcome you to our webinar, Overturning Roe, More Than Abortion is at Stake, and how overturning Roe can unite and ignite advocacy for all pregnant people. I'm Lynn Paltrow, and Dorothy Roberts, my esteemed colleague, is going to begin by introducing herself.
Hi, thanks, Lynn, and welcome everybody. I'm Dorothy Roberts. I am a professor at University of Pennsylvania in the law school and also in sociology and Africana studies, and a longtime advocate for reproductive justice. I go way back to the late 1980s when I began my research on the state regulation of Black women's bodies, which ended up in my book, Killing the Black Body. And Lynn and I have worked together all that time. In fact, I just pulled out an article that I wrote as a result of a conference that I remembered was the first time Lynn and I worked together back at Rutgers Law School, where I was teaching at the time in 1989. So we are, what is that, 30 years or something? I think it is 30 years of advocacy. And what links Lynn and me together is our work on behalf of pregnant women who want to have their babies and continue their pregnancies to term, and pointing out the way in which state control has intensified and how that harms all of us, and how that must be part of advocacy for reproductive justice. And so I'm really thrilled to be able to join with Lynn today to talk about this aspect of the possibility of overturning Roe and why the principles in Roe versus Wade and the principles for reproductive justice are important for all pregnant people.
Thank you, Dorothy. And I'm Lynn Paltrow, the founder and executive director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. We are a nonprofit advocacy organization. A core understanding is that the people who have abortions are the same people who at some point give birth, overwhelmingly give birth and become parents. They are also people who experience miscarriages and pregnancy losses, and they are all people who have benefited from Roe v. Wade. National Advocates for Pregnant Women is the leading organization that provides criminal defense on behalf of women who are being targeted for arrests and detentions and other mechanisms of state control because they're pregnant or because of a pregnancy outcome, whether it's a miscarriage, a stillbirth, or a pregnancy loss, or an abortion. I'm really privileged to be here with Dorothy, who, in addition to being able to remember when we first met, I have a slide for you, just a few photos.
This is the scary part.
Conferences. Dorothy was generous and a major part of two of NAPW's major conferences, one on fetal rights and state power, and the other about bringing together those who advocate for birth rights and birth justice with those who advocate for abortion rights and justice. And she has just been a tremendous ally as well as teacher and leader. This webinar, there's been a lot already given since the announcement that Justice Kennedy was going to resign, and then President Trump's announcement of Brett Kavanaugh as his nominee. A lot of concern about what will happen to many cases, and particularly Roe v. Wade. And so far, most of the focus has been on what will happen to access to abortion, what will happen to the women who can't get abortions, what will happen to women who live in some states versus others. What this webinar focuses on is the fact that it is not on abortion, but the people who sometimes need abortion. And they are the same people who always need to be treated as full constitutional persons with full human rights, including access to all the health care that they need. Roe v. Wade not only recognized reproductive rights that the 6 million people who become pregnant every year in the United States, all of whom benefit from that. Roe also explicitly rejected the argument that fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses are constitutional persons at any stage of development. And in doing that, the court affirmed that women at all stages of pregnancy are constitutional persons whose lives and health are paramount.
Yes, so in that context of waiting to see who Trump's Supreme Court nominee would be, and thinking about the implications for that confirmation and the possibility that Roe could be overturned, and all of that protection for women as full human beings entitled to full rights, whether or not they're pregnant, might be in jeopardy. I was invited to speak on the Ali Velshi show on MSNBC. I had already been invited to be there on the 4th of July. I assumed to talk about some aspect of social justice and how the 4th of July represents a contradiction of the principles of equality and justice. And it happened to be in the midst of all of this talk about who the next Supreme Court justice would be and the implications for Roe. It also happened that the day before, on July 3rd, I had been engaged in a Twitter conversation about whether or not it was possible that women would be arrested for abortions if Roe versus Wade were overturned. And Aziza Ahmad had tweeted that I had argued for so long that some mothers, Black and Latina, were always deemed less sympathetic and had been prosecuted for being pregnant. And I chimed in that, yes, it was absolutely realistic to predict that women will be prosecuted and imprisoned for having abortions. And part of my argument for that, which I put in a tweet, was that women are already being locked up for miscarriages and stillbirths, starting with women of color, and that we have to see these ways of criminalizing pregnant women, whether it's for abortion or for pregnancy losses or for being pregnant while engaging in some conduct, that those are all related. And so when I appeared the next day on the Ali Velshi show, he read my tweet on air and asked me about it. He also noted that in support of what I had tweeted, President Trump himself had said that women should be punished for having abortions. And so I explained what I was saying in that tweet. If Roe is overturned, as Lynn has said, states will be free to make abortion a crime from the moment of conception, or maybe even the possibility that a woman person might conceive. Women are already arrested for being pregnant and engaging in some conduct allegedly risky to a fetus, and for pregnancy losses. So certainly, if Roe is overturned, those would only increase, because it would give prosecutors more leeway, more legal leeway to make pregnancy a crime. Already, there have been prosecutions, a whole host of them, in South Carolina, way back in the early 1990s, late 1980s. Cornelia Whitner was convicted of child neglect because she was pregnant while using drugs, but because of her pregnancy, the South Carolina Supreme Court upheld her conviction for harming a viable fetus, equating a viable fetus with a child. In 1997, Regina McKnight spent 8 years in prison for experiencing a stillbirth that was called a homicide by child abuse. Purvi Patel was convicted of feticide. That was overturned, but her conviction for child neglect was sustained. So there are, I could go on, and Lynn will say more about the women that that National Advocates for Pregnant Women has represented. And so women who terminate their pregnancies or are suspected of terminating their pregnancies, a woman who has a miscarriage who's suspected of doing something to cause it, those people could be charged with a crime and potentially arrested and locked up from the moment of conception if Roe is overturned. And in addition, all pregnant people would be at risk because the norms that Lynn was talking about, that pregnant people have equal rights, would be overturned as well. And so then the idea that people who are pregnant have fewer rights and are subject to state control, greater state control, because of their pregnancy or the potential to be pregnant, would be now part of the law. And so I felt I was just stating the facts of arrests and imprisonment that have already occurred, and the logic of if Roe is overturned, obviously these would happen even more because there would be more legal basis for them. I thought that was pretty logical and self-explanatory and rooted in evidence, but the reaction that I got from right-wing pundits and bloggers and people on Twitter, anti-abortion folks, was that I was lying. I was a lunatic. So the Daily Caller published this and tweeted that I was saying that the next U.S. Supreme Court justice would put women in jail for miscarriages, and chicks on the right said I was a pro. Said that I was accusing them of being lunatics for criminalizing abortion, but actually they would not ever support blaming a woman if it wasn't obviously her fault. And then we could go to the next one that I was lying because this had never happened before, that women were jailed for miscarriages. And then the next, the Washington Examiner said, well, if we who support Roe see someone just looking at the ruling funny, we lose our composure and entirely succumb to outlandish, feverish fantasies pulled out of the wildest corners of our minds. So they were portraying what I said as if there was no shred of facts to support it, that these arrests actually were not occurring, had never occurred, and that there was absolutely no fear that women would be prosecuted, and really was not only for miscarriages, but for other pregnancy losses, or that there was any risk to women being criminalized for being pregnant.
Thank you, Dorothy. And my job, among others, is to provide even more documentation and validation for everything you said. And if anything, you were cautiously understated.
Yes. That's what I thought.
But we want to start with, if Dorothy is right that there are likely to be even more arrests, and I will get to the evidence of the ones that have already happened, why is it, how is it that many of the organizations that oppose abortion continue to reassure their base that, of course, even if Roe is overturned, if abortion is made a crime, if it is illegal, the women who have abortions won't go to jail, they won't be treated as criminals. And here are just two examples of statements various leaders of anti-abortion organizations have made. No pro-lifer would ever want to punish. We only have compassion. And the way that they speak to their own base and others as well is to start out with the claim that before Roe, no woman was arrested for having an abortion. So after, when it was in the power of the states, after Roe, no woman will be arrested for having an abortion. But that claim is simply not true. Look at the case of Shirley Wheeler. In 1971, Shirley was living in Florida. She got pregnant. Her doctor advised her it would be, for health reasons, she should have an abortion. It was illegal in Florida, as in most states still in 1971. And she found an illegal abortion provider. And it was not a completed abortion. She was hemorrhaging. She went to the hospital, and they suspected her of having had an abortion. And rather than give her confidential care, rather than guarantee her all of her health and confidentiality, they called the police. They reported her as being suspected of having an illegal abortion. Police came to her bedside, interrogated her. When she did not reveal the name of the person who performed the abortion, they arrested her. Not for an illegal abortion, but for the crime of manslaughter with a potential sentence of 20 years. She went to trial. She was convicted. She wasn't sentenced to 20 years. She was, however, sentenced to 2 years of probation with the kind of conditions that many people in the criminal justice system face. She had to get a job. She couldn't stay out overnight. She couldn't enter a bar, couldn't hang out with people of harmful character, had to pay the court over $500. And they gave her an ultimatum: stay in Florida and marry the man she was living with, or in less than a week, or within a week, return to North Carolina to live with a different man, her brother. That's just one example. There were other arrests before Roe. 18 states at the time had express penalties for women having self-abortions or participating in an abortion. Today, there are 6 states that still have those kinds of laws. Women were arrested for aiding and abetting. They were arrested for being participating in conspiracy to have an abortion. But there's a certain truth in what is said because we live in a very different time than the 1970s. In the 1970s, very few people were being incarcerated for anything, and very few women in particular. So it wasn't that women weren't being arrested just for illegal abortions. They basically weren't being arrested. This wasn't the way our society was dealing with a whole variety of public health and social welfare issues. And you can see from this chart how the number of people who are incarcerated has so dramatically increased from the 1970s to, in this slide, 2006. We see a 500% increase in incarceration over the last 40 years, 2.2 million people in prisons and jails. And this is not the result of population growth. Between 1970 and 2000, the US population rose by less than 40%, yet the number of people in prisons and jails rose by more than 400%. And this is a slide specifically about women. So any hesitation that there once was before Roe was decided to incarcerate women, most of whom are mothers, has no longer exists. How did this come about? What are the social, political, legal things that happened? Among them were the war on drugs. And here are some books that give you the history and context concerning the war on drugs that put into place so many new ways for states to surveil people, control people, drug test people. And by the way, if you've ever had a drug test for a job or anything else, remember, they can also test that urine for pregnancy. So there are mechanisms, including much more available wiretapping and other things that just didn't exist in 1973. And so we now have a system where so many women, the greatest growing number of people who are incarcerated are in fact women, most of whom are mothers. And in addition to this overarching system where we now allow companies, private corporations, to profit from incarcerating people, immigrants in detention centers, prisoners in jails and prisons across the country, and other ways of profiting from incarcerating people, we also have many more things that have been criminalized. And among those, before Roe, there was no such crime as feticide. 38 states now have that crime on the books. So prosecutors have many, many crimes to choose from if they want to arrest a woman in relationship to her pregnancy. And in fact, we have documented numerous arrests. Our study, peer-reviewed, people can argue about it, but we've got the documentation People in my office really want me to get rid of the hard files, but I see people don't believe us. These arrests have happened, 413 cases between 1995, and we know that to be an undercount because of the way, the lack of attention to these cases. We also know that the arrests target particular groups of people. 72% in our study were poor, low income, 59% of the women were women of color, and grossly disproportionately 52% were African American. We have continued to document arrests, and we know that since our study stopped, or the numbers in our study stopped in 2005, we've been able to document at least 800 more cases. So this, everything Dorothy said is absolutely true and very well documented. One of the things that we have to remember is that among those arrests were women before 2005 who were accused of having unlawful abortions even after Roe. And in the last few years, there have been a number of arrests of women accused of having unlawful abortions under existing laws like Idaho's that continue to criminalize self-abortion. Other crimes, as you've heard in the Purvi Patel case, feticide, attempted feticide, and various other crimes, including concealing birth, have been brought and actually have happened. And there has been a resounding silence from the anti-abortion groups who claim they don't want to see women go to jail, but apparently they have no problem with seeing these people go to prisons and jails. Here are other headlines of recent cases in Virginia and in Arkansas and elsewhere. Now, the NAPW has participated in the defense of many of these women and supported them. And most of the time, we have been able to get those charges overturned, reversed, sometimes, however, only after someone's been incarcerated for a very long time. Part of the reason we've been able to have these victories is because Roe is on the books, because Roe says that you cannot treat fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses as separate persons, and by doing that, subtract women themselves from the community of constitutional persons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even the Cornelia Whitner case, where the Supreme Court of South Carolina upheld her conviction for child abuse, the court said, we can uphold it because it's a viable fetus. We could, because she was pregnant with a viable fetus when she engaged in this allegedly risky conduct. But what if Roe were overturned? Then the logic would say we can arrest women for being pregnant while engaging in some conduct supposedly risky to the fetus from the moment of conception.
And if I may interrupt and just build on that,
yeah.
We know that 15 to 20 or 25% of pregnancies end in miscarriage and stillbirth. By becoming pregnant, a woman is endangering a fertilized egg embryo.
Exactly.
The whole idea of pregnancy is as a form of harm is part of a larger defamation of women, an attack on our fundamental equality that people have not yet really fully accounted for.
Absolutely, and there's no difference, and especially if we move all the way to the beginning of a pregnancy and include taking abortion pills or any kind of conduct engaged in while pregnant, all the range of possibilities, including, as you said, miscarriages, stillbirths. I agree with you, it makes being pregnant a crime. And we can see that prosecutors will actually go after pregnant people and arrest them. So that was the point I was making. And I think your evidence, Lynn, and the work you're doing, it's just irrefutable. So then what happens? What happens when you present this irrefutable evidence and logic, just plain old logic of what's going to happen if Roe is overturned? What I found on Twitter was this huge denial by anti-abortion activists and everyday people about the logic and the facts. And so they just refuse to face the possibility, not just the probability that women will be arrested for miscarriages, for being pregnant, period. And, so allegedly risking a fetus. So I got responses on Twitter as I pushed to say, well, don't you see, don't you see what this could lead to? The response is often, well, all the women that you told me about, like Purvi Patel, like Regina McKnight, like Cornelia Whitner, and others, they were barbaric women who caused, as this Twitter says, caused harm to their babies, their unborn babies. Number one, they call the fetus an unborn baby, regardless of what point in pregnancy it is, and they almost put out an image of killing a baby to describe all of this range of possibilities and actualities that Lynn and I have been talking about. So that's one thing they do. The other thing they do is they distinguish between intentionally killing and these accidents, not understanding that many of the women that we've just been talking about have not been found to intentionally harm the fetus. They just had a pregnancy loss, or they were pregnant. Many of them, as we've been saying, were intending to give birth to a baby, and they wanted to have a healthy baby even. And so these responses are confusing the mens rea, the mental state, by believing that that a prosecutor will have to show some evidence of intending to kill a baby. That's just not true at all. There was no evidence of that in Regina McKnight's case, for example, and in fact, the court said that and confused as well. Even the court confused the mental state required. So they refused to confront the fact that a wide range of possibility for women to be charged with crimes because they're pregnant, that there doesn't have to be some intentional desire, and also they distinguish between themselves and their pregnancy losses and these other women, who are engaged in some kind of barbaric, and they've often used that term, act that deserves punishment. Well, first of all, they're then admitting that they're fine with arresting and imprisoning certain women as long as they can distinguish those women from themselves. So this idea, when you push them on it, the idea that, oh, we're compassionate, we're not going to arrest and jail anybody, that's just not true. Many of them were willing to say they deserved what they got. But the other is, and maybe you could put back up the tweet from the woman who said, how dare you equate my miscarriage with what these other, yes, okay. So first she says, you are lying, lying when I said that women who have miscarriages could be arrested and are being arrested. And so, or having, or stillbirths. And again, she says, that's killing a living baby. And then she distinguishes herself. I had a miscarriage. My baby died. I did nothing to cause it and would have done anything to bring her back. Don't you dare compare my loss to someone who killed a child intentionally. So there's this idea that she's exempt, but it's fine to prosecute, arrest, imprison women who she can conceive of as intentionally killing a child, and not willing to face the reality that the prosecutions won't stop at that if Roe is overturned, or and what I was really trying to get people to think about is, what is the difference? What is the difference? What makes you culpable, not culpable, but a woman who does decide to terminate a pregnancy culpable? And so I think also it's important to point out that behind this, I believe, even though they don't explicitly say it, is a racist willingness to see the arrests and imprisonment of women of color who some more privileged white women are incapable or don't want to associate themselves or see themselves in alliance in any way with the women whose images they've seen who have been arrested. And so I found that whole engagement very, very enlightening. It was disturbing, but also enlightening, because it shows how much the anti-abortion movement hinges on those first messages that you showed, Lynn, that we're compassionate. We don't want any woman to go to jail, that they have trouble dealing with the reality of women being arrested and jailed, and the contradiction between that and the reality of that and what they claim is their compassionate position toward women who have abortions.
Well, I think that's very consistent with what some of the exploration of people who've voted for Trump. And you say to them, you know, he could take away your health care that you rely on, and somehow convince themselves that they don't mean them personally. Somehow they will be protected from it. Yeah. And on the question of intent, I mean, one of the things that's happened is criminal laws have expanded and multiplied, and you don't just have murder, you have reckless endangerment. You just have to engage in an action. As you said, you don't have to have the intent. And the perfect example is Laura Pemberton was a woman who is profoundly opposed to abortion, believes it's murder, was attempting to avoid an unnecessary cesarean surgery. The hospital found out, they called the sheriff, they came and they got her, they strapped her legs together while she was in active labor, took her to the hospital where she got to represent herself as they were preparing her for surgery, decided upon by doctors who actually had never examined her. And they forced her to undergo a cesarean that in retrospect was unnecessary, partly known because she then went on to have 3 more children vaginally without cesarean surgery. But in talking to her, because she was willing to engage with us around our 2007 conference, she brought a civil rights lawsuit saying her rights had been violated. She didn't come to us, unfortunately, and she didn't argue against the concept of separate rights for fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses. And what the court basically said is, if we're allowed to tell you you can't have an abortion, we can force you to give birth a certain way. And I kept saying, but do you understand that it's the anti-abortion legal arguments? I'm not asking you to be for abortion, but do you understand that those arguments are what were used against you? And she said, that can't be true, and that can't be true. And finally, her explanation, understandably, was because I didn't intend to hurt my baby. But what people have to understand, and it's hard, is that once the government can control your medical decisions and control you, what your actual intent is, they will assign it.
Exactly.
So, in addition to those cases, and there are many of those, Roe has been, later cases in Roe have said, look, it's been sensibly relied on to counter attempts to interfere with a woman's decision to continue her pregnancy to term. And they cite 2 cases in which they say a county violated the constitutional rights of a young woman who they tried to coerce into having an abortion. That Roe v. Wade recognizes reproductive rights in all directions, in all aspects of reproductive decision-making and life. In another case, they falsely told a teenager who was pregnant that she had the sickle cell trait. She didn't have the sickle cell trait, and that if she continued her pregnancy and didn't get sterilized, she would lose years on her life. And they apparently, the decision says she got sterilized, but it's only understandable if they must have also ended her pregnancy in that process. If Roe is overturned and there is a recognition of separate rights for fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses, all bets are off. One state says that passes the so-called personhood measure, unborn life, has separate constitutional standing, and you want to travel to New York? Oh, great, New York, California, we can still get abortions. You admit you're leaving. Is that kidnapping? Mm-hmm. Is that attempted murder? What are your risks going and coming back from having had an abortion that was legal in one state and considered murder in another? The power of the state becomes extraordinary. Detentions to protect the unborn. In the Cornelia Whitner case, she gave birth to a perfectly healthy baby. So what's the crime? The crime is being Black and giving birth, being Black and pregnant, or simply escaping the control of the government. There have been cases, pull this up. All kinds of cases. So it is the pregnancy itself under a reversal of Roe that recognized separate rights for fertilized eggs and embryos that can make a pregnant woman who falls down the flight of stairs charged with attempted feticide, a woman who's pregnant and HIV positive, a woman who is human and becomes so distraught she attempts suicide. All of these cases have actually happened, recognized not only through our work and our documentation, but also, as you'll see in the right corner, the research and documentation by Amnesty International. And you have as well more cases in which efforts have been made to arrest women or threaten arrest of women if they don't agree with their doctor's advice regarding cesarean surgery or just even the timing of cesarean surgery. And in New York, there's an ongoing lawsuit involving Renate Dre. They forced her to have cesarean surgery. It turned out they had a hospital policy that announced when doctors could make a woman undergo surgery over her explicit objections. And thus far, her challenges have not succeeded, in part because a lower New York state court talked about the fact that New York still has on the books a law that criminalizes self-abortion, and refusing cesarean surgery might be tantamount to having an abortion. And therefore, people other than the woman can decide for her what happens and literally take control of her being and force her to be subjected to surgery, which in her case included cutting through her bladder, required significant surgical repairs. People don't think about other possibilities, including the fact that husbands and boyfriends have gone into civil court to try to get orders to keep their pregnant wives and girlfriends from leaving the state. It isn't just through the criminal laws. She's taking my unborn child out of state. You could have entire used to control every aspect of a pregnant woman's life. We've seen guardians ad litem increasingly appointed for fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses. Again, is this the future? Is this the future we have to stop? Loss of medical privacy, making in vitro fertilization at home or in a medical setting, prevent people from funds and need those medications to be able to safely recover from and overcome their miscarriages. Many people recently saw the story about a Walgreens pharmacist denying a woman who desperately wanted that pregnancy, who didn't want to be in the position of having to empty her uterus without having a baby, and yet being treated as if she were a criminal, as if she were immoral. And we found a story from 2015, basically the same facts: a Walgreens, a refusal of giving a certain class of people, pregnant women, access to the medications they need. The last example people might not have thought of is Roe v. Wade. In order to go into federal court, to have access to our system of law, to the possibility of equality and fairness under the Constitution, you have to have an actual case in controversy. It's written in the Constitution. So you can't just bring a case because you don't like it. You actually have to have what's called standing. You have to have something happen to you personally when you bring that suit. The problem is pregnancy only lasts 9 months, and civil rights litigation can go on for decades. And one of the things that Roe did was say, look, we have to have an exception to the rule that it's happening to you right this minute today. Otherwise, no woman could ever challenge the abortion laws. And they called that exception It's an exception to the doctrine of mootness. It's called capable of repetition, yet evading review. And I just want to say that Rehnquist in Roe v. Wade, in his dissent, really called into question that exception to the doctrine of mootness, that exception that would make the federal court system available in all sorts of contexts, including the case of Alicia Beltran and Tammy Later that have been happening in Wisconsin, your access to the federal court system. And the nominee, Judge Kavanaugh, has said that his hero is Rehnquist, and he specifically talked about Rehnquist's opinion, dissenting opinion in Roe, which could mean not only the end of Roe, but the end of ways of challenging those kinds of laws in the court system.
Yeah, and thinking about everything you just said, Lynn, and the Walgreens case and the cases of husbands coming in or boyfriends coming in and saying you can't leave the state, bringing civil suits, pharmacists believing that they should determine what drugs someone should have just because they're pregnant. Imagine what the world will be like without Roe, where anything a pregnant woman does makes her suspect just because she's pregnant. We've had this rash of 911 calls on Black people, with white people calling up and saying, oh, that little kid is selling lemonade without a license, or they're barbecuing or they're in the neighborhood and they look suspicious. Now think about the calls that will go into police, right? Or child abuse hotlines. That already happens, too frequently, with people falsely being accused of any pregnant woman, where someone thinks, oh, I don't think she's acting right, for whatever the reason could be. I mean, it adds to, in such a profound sense, the way in which our whole society thinks about the equal rights of people because they're pregnant, and the ability to call on the state to control them. It's really, and putting it all together in this webinar, I think also, we've both been working on this for decades, as we said, but it's still mind-boggling when I think about the potential for erasing that norm that people are equally human and have equal rights and equal freedoms, even though they're pregnant. It just is something we really need to be alarmed about. So I'm, now to look at what do we do about this. I have, when I wrote a preface for the 20th anniversary edition of Killing the Black Body, and I wrote at the beginning, I was filled with a mix of exasperation, but also expectation. Exasperation because so many of the policies of arrest that I had written about back in 1997 were still going on. And in fact, with laws being passed, fetal protection laws being passed, and escalation of the women incarcerated, that all of that had made things worse in many ways. On the other hand, expectation, because there now had been, in the meantime, in the last 20 years, the emergence, based on a long history of organizing, but an emergence of a movement for reproductive justice, and a movement led by women of color. The term was coined by that's the slide, by a caucus of Black women at a pro-choice conference. And it represents a very useful, effective, and liberatory framework for thinking about these issues. So reproductive justice encompasses the range of people's reproductive lives, not just the decision to terminate a pregnancy, but also the decision to have a baby, to be pregnant, and to also to parent a child. So we could include in this discussion state control in the form of taking away the babies of women because of allegations about their unfitness to mother, as a form of penalty for being pregnant. In Killing the Black Body, I say that those arrests weren't to protect the women or their children. It was a form of criminalizing them for being pregnant. And so reproductive justice encompasses this full range, the conditions under which a woman gives birth. So it would cover the 4 cesarean sections that you mentioned, Lynn. It would encompass being able to have a home birth. And so it includes and understands the connections between all these various forms of state control of pregnant people, whether it's penalizing them, criminalizing them for terminating a pregnancy, or criminalizing them for being pregnant. It also focuses on our full human rights, and it pays attention to not just a decision that you might make in your head, but also the social and economic and political conditions that are necessary to have true reproductive freedom. And so it is and has been shown to be a very powerful framework for organizing, not only across groups of women, but also other people and other movements. And so I included these images from the March for Women's Lives in 2004 because it was a march that was led by reproductive justice advocates and garnered the support of a broad range of people who were not only dedicated to reproductive justice, but also to racial justice, economic justice, health equity, environmental justice, recognizing that all of these movements for a more equal and just and humane society are entangled with each other, and we can be in alliance with each other. And that's what gives me hope for being able to ward off either overturning Roe, but even if it is overturned, being able to advocate for the humanity of all people, whether they're pregnant or not. Even pregnant people have human rights and equal humanity. Oh, and I guess there was one more thing. So the next slide is also another aspect of my Twitter engagement, was that it wasn't just anti-abortion people. Most of the responses I got were very supportive, but also an interesting response by this person who at first accused me of lying about arrests of women for pregnancy losses. And then when I presented her with actual cases, she came back and apologized for being uninformed and thanking me for bringing these injustices to light. So I think that's part of why we're doing this webinar, certainly to inform people who are already on board with reproductive justice, but also there may be people who just don't know what's going on. And if they're willing to think about the reality that is happening and the implications for it, may change their minds about their opposition to Roe and to other kinds of protections for the rights of pregnant people.
And those are reasons why this moment in history is an opportunity to, as we said, unite and ignite. And that's been happening for a while with a lot of new organizations finally being recognized, leadership finally being recognized. It's an opportunity. I mean, I think one of the things that, as bad as things are, I think it has made many people, and particularly white people, think about the lack of equality, recognize that the gains, particularly that were made, particularly for white women, really don't go very deep and don't extend to other women, and gives us an opportunity to re-examine and ask, what else do we have to do? What do we really want? And I think we want much more than Roe. And this is a moment where we could get trapped in that same thing of defending Roe. Right. Abortion under Roe is in the criminal code in most states. Don't we want to make sure it's not there? We don't want to just make sure that Roe stays. We want to make sure that healthcare for everybody is accessible and meaningful, and that it is regulated as health, not as a crime. Don't we want to do more than make sure that women don't die in back alleys from having abortions, as that expression goes? And there are still, despite medications that are available, women like Anna Yoka, and a woman in California recently had her boyfriend beat her up. These things are happening, will happen. Don't we want to ask for more, though? Don't we also want to make sure that no woman has to worry about dying in childbirth, and particularly Black women? Don't we want to make sure that women don't have to travel 100 miles for an abortion? And they also don't have to travel 100 miles to give birth, as the front page of the New York Times in print yesterday talked about. Don't we want to have people have access to good health care without limitations on the title of the person giving it to them? Roe said states can limit abortion to physicians when we know that non-physicians can do it safely, that we want to make sure that people have access to doulas and midwives and the support they need without arbitrary limitations. Here are two things I think people might not realize that we can count on going forward. There is no way that the organizations that oppose abortion can keep their promise to their base, who really believe that when they say we care about women and we're not sending them to jail. They're going to see people going to jail, because many of those people, some of those people are white, but many of those people are low income. And the targets right now of arrests are predominantly rural white women. And pro-life people, by the way, get abortions. Every abortion provider will tell you that. But they justify it saying, but I know that what I'm doing is wrong, and I'm a good person at doing this. Those women are bad. I think they're going to see more connections. People who oppose abortion, who want to have home births, don't want to have to worry about going to jail. People who oppose abortions and need to escape violent husbands and boyfriends when they're pregnant are going to be are going to wake up. And I think that one of the things that is most important to remember is laws recriminalizing and criminalizing abortion don't stop people from having abortions. And while people don't have abortions as a political act, to make a political statement, they have so many other reasons to doing it. The collective action of 1 million people a year is a form of mass civil disobedience, something the government cannot control, something that will join with all of the other forms of nonviolent civil disobedience, nonviolence against the government, nonviolence against the people who try to deprive us of control over our lives and our families. We can count on it. And my last thought for the day is, with all of the commentary about President Trump and what people have called his treasonous actions, the fight to stop the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh might have much more power to say, this is not the president who should be able to change the direction of this country. And certainly what we need is a change of direction that addresses our history of extraordinary racism, the legacy of slavery, and the fact that there are all kinds of women, poor women, pregnant women, who have never been recognized, even in name, as full constitutional persons. I think we have a few minutes left, and we can answer some questions in our remaining minutes. Let's see if you posted. Okay. One question is, how do we engage more fully movements against incarceration and still tend to focus on men? What obstacles have you seen over the years that need to be addressed? I think that's a particularly helpful one. I think that we're all easily have our feelings hurt when we go to a meeting and they don't want to hear from us. We have to stay in the rooms. We have to keep talking to them. I know for a fact that the Drug Policy Alliance is working on a new campaign regarding ending mass criminalization, and they are including reproductive rights, health, and justice. So it is true. What do? We go. We do not give up. We engage and we build relationships with people rather than separate into our little silos.
Yeah, and also there has been a very, very strong movement of Black women and other women of color pointing out the extremely high rates of incarceration of women of color, especially Black and Latino women. And so that has made an impact on the movements for Black lives, on other organizing against incarceration. There is more and more historical information coming out about the long history of criminalizing Black women, for example, in spaces that have been viewed as solely the spaces of criminalizing men. Say her name, you know, I could go on with ways in which we have intervened in this narrow way of thinking about mass incarceration. And also, it's important to recognize that movements against mass incarceration or for prison abolition are also integrally related to reproductive justice on a number of grounds, not just the fact that people's reproductive freedom is constrained while they're incarcerated, but there are deeper ways in which the notions about reproducing criminality have been excuses for criminalizing pregnant people, especially pregnant Black women. So stay in the room, organize, bring alliances to bring together reproductive justice and prison abolition advocacy. And that is an extremely powerful coalition that could be built further for justice.
Well, and one of the things that we work to prevent is if Roe goes, and it goes in the way that the most anti-abortion people hope it will, recognition of fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses, you open up the 6 million people who get pregnant every year to potential profit-making incarceration. And yes, absolutely, our criminal justice system, our punitive civil child welfare system all target Black and brown families and low-income white families in very particular targeted ways, but that there are an awful lot of people who could become fodder for that industry. Yeah. And what people don't understand, I mean, you see some of the dialogue in the anti-choice movement where they'll say, well, there probably should be some penalty, but you know, women, they can raise mental health issues, their defense. They make it sound like everybody who's arrested in America gets Perry Mason for their lawyers, for those of you who are older, and that they have access to lawyers, they have access to experts. If you're arrested on a charge of murder, as Bebe Shui was in Indiana, for attempting suicide and in the end losing a pregnancy she very much wanted, there was no bail. You get arrested and you sit in jail because for years potentially because the charge is murder. Once you're in jail, think about how pregnant people are treated when they're incarcerated. That's why there's whole movements now challenging, and Sister Song just had a webinar about shackling pregnant women, incarcerated pregnant women. They are so devalued, so they're not only them, but the babies that they're going to have, that they are literally kept in chains and shackles during labor and delivery or shortly thereafter. And even with the gains that have been made, and they are really out front making change in the law, then we have to have the power to enforce it. So the question is also getting people the support they need after they've given birth. and making sure that they're giving birth where they are actually safe and supported, not where somebody is controlling them and telling them what to do.
Yeah.
So I think we are pretty much out of time. We will do our best to provide further information. This webinar has been recorded. We will make it available. And I want to, are we out of time?
You can stay on and answer some questions.
Okay. I have just been told by Patrick and answer some more questions. Dorothy, can you see the questions too?
I can't, but you're kind of, if you state them, there may be something I could push to see. Oh, I see Q&A.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And let me just say, I would have to leave in about 10 minutes.
Okay.
So, okay? Because
Yep.
I have a 2:30 talk to teenagers about these issues. So, yeah.
So speaking of teenagers, one of the questions dealt with what was happening at the border to families. And this, I spent a little time looking at, again, the anti-choice websites and commentary, and it was fascinating because they were trying to point to a certain hypocrisy that people, Democrats, people on the left, were opposing family separation. And they suggested that this was extraordinarily hypocritical since the same side defends abortion, separating unborn children from their mothers. And, I thought, there's a superficial logic to that, but actually none at all, because in one case, it is about the government taking control and destroying families. And in the other, it is government ensuring that individuals control their own bodies, their own lives, and make the decisions they need. We know that government has a very important role to play in ensuring the health and welfare and safety of its citizens, which they can do through social welfare programs, through all kinds of legislation and support. But it never works when the government thinks it can make better decisions for individuals about what their health care should be, what medications they should take. It is always a disaster when government officials are empowered to make those decisions for any of us. So that would be one of the comments.
Well, and also what's going on separating families at the border is very similar to policies that have gone on in the United States that separate especially Black and Indigenous, Native American children from their parents. Deliberate policies in the case of Native Americans to assimilate them into white culture and decimate tribes. And in the case of African Americans, a policy that's gone on since the time of slavery to devalue the family bonds of Black people and to have control. It's a form of state control, what we've been talking about, just another form that extends beyond giving birth and being pregnant to the control of families. And so when a lot of what I'm hearing at the border sounds so familiar to me because I hear about it going on and have studied it and seen it in our foster care system as well. And it reflects both a lack of valuing those bonds, but also a politics of controlling families and family decision-making as a way of subordinating a group of people. In addition, there have been reports coming out of detention centers about the horrible treatment of pregnant people in those centers, including one report of women who were having miscarriages, who were completely neglected and not given medical care and treated in a very dehumanizing way. And so it's not surprising that we see these continuances through history and also across different institutions in our society that treat pregnant people in this valued way, whether it's in prison, whether it's in the home, in the hospital, in a detention center. They're linked together. And going back to our conversation about what do we do, if people can see these linkages and and see a common interest in treating people as equal human beings. I mean, I know it sounds kind of, basic, but that's really what this is about. Then we can form very, very powerful alliances and movements to not only uphold Roe, but go far beyond it in the ways that we were talking about.
Exactly. And this is why, if it does come to the point where there is, the hearings start to happen around the nominees, there's all this debate about, you're going to ask if they're going to overturn Roe, and they, sort of answer, they don't answer, they have ways around it. But the question, we will have succeeded and moved forward if the question that actually gets asked is, do you think there's a point in pregnancy where people lose their civil rights?
Exactly.
Among the questions are, if you're making a distinction between the rights of fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses and women, there's no possibility of balancing or equal,
right?
Because they occur in the same body.
Yeah.
There is only one set of rights, and that has to be the pregnant person. Otherwise, we are conceding that really people with the capacity for pregnancy and who become pregnant are a separate and unequal class of persons that can be forced to undergo cesarean surgery, kept in bed on bed rest, prevented from using certain or benefiting from certain medications, prevented from being recognized as human beings who have mental health issues and survival issues and have to make difficult choices every day of their lives. So the question is about the personhood of a whole lot of people in the United States who have never been fully recognized as persons. And that includes Black people, it includes trans people, it includes everybody with the capacity for pregnancy.
Yeah. And if we can, I hope that that's the message that comes out of this webinar and the work that we do, because I think my engagement with people on Twitter, that's what the lesson I learned, they don't want to face that. They don't want to face that because they know either internally, they don't want to recognize that that's the position that they're arguing for, or they know that if they don't care, they want pregnant people to have no civil rights, they know that that's a losing position. It's an untenable position. And so that's why when we say, that's exactly what you are arguing for, they say, you're lying. You're lying, because they can't face the reality of the implication of that position. So,
which proves two things.
Yeah.
One is that denial is an incredibly powerful human instinct, and also that you were making a tremendous difference and that engagement actually mattered. So I thank you so much for doing this webinar.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for all your work over all these years. I think that now people are getting what we've been saying for 30 years. This is connected. This is all connected, and we have to advocate for pregnant people's humanity, whether they want to end a pregnancy or continue it. It doesn't matter. It's connected. They're human beings. We're human beings. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all for watching and listening, and we will make posts about this following.
Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, everybody.